A white teacher smirks and says, "Since you think you're special, why don't you show us how well you dance?" The class bursts into laughter, but as the music starts, something incredible happens. Something that proves Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was right. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Stay till the end to witness a moment that will leave you speechless. The spring sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows of the studio, casting long, shimmering streaks across the wooden floor, like threads of golden silk. The air inside the ballet room carried a sense of manufactured perfection. White tutus flared out, billowing like petals as the dancers twirled. Point shoes skimmed the floor, every movement executed with flawless precision. And yet, amidst all that light, there was a shadowed corner. Aaliyah Johnson stood quietly near the glass wall, separate from the rest. She was not part of those graceful motions. Her practice attire bore no delicate lace, no flowing silk, just a simple outfit hugging her small, slender frame. Unremarkable, unnoticed. She was not the center. She had never been the center. A round of applause broke the air. "Wonderful, Emily." Mr. Coleman walked through the students, his gaze filled with approval as it lingered on each girl. "Very good, Sophia. Hold that position." Aaliyah watched them. One by one, she had memorized these movements. She had practiced them countless times in the quiet hours of the night when no one was watching. But she knew, no matter how hard she tried, she remained invisible in this room. Coleman's gaze passed over her. Not a word, not a nod. She bit, her lower lip, fingers tightening around the hem of her shirt. Emily made a mistake, a slight imbalance in her pirouette. "That's all right. Try again." Mr. Coleman patiently adjusted her stance. Another student faltered. She winced, but still received his guidance. And Aaliyah? She had executed every move perfectly. But no one looked. No one cared. Not a single sound. Only she could hear the quickened rhythm of her own heartbeat, feel the steady strength in her legs, knowing she had done everything right. But nothing changed. Class was winding down. The students began to relax. Aaliyah exhaled softly. Maybe today would pass like every other. Then, Aaliyah. Silence. The murmurs stopped. Heads turned. Aaliyah froze. She wasn't used to hearing her name. She looked up. Coleman stood there, arms crossed, a smirk ghosting his lips. "You've been watching all class." He tilted his head, voice dripping with mockery. "Why not show us a little of that talent?" The air in the room thickened, a few stifled giggles. She felt the stares, not encouraging, but expectant, waiting for her to fail. She probably doesn't even know how to dance. A whisper. Not loud enough for Mr. Coleman to hear, but sharp, enough to pierce straight through her. She knew this. She knew they were waiting for her to fall. She knew this wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. She could refuse. She could shake her head, find an excuse, slip back into the background. But Mr. Coleman's eyes told her one thing. "I know you won't dare." She inhaled deeply. In her mind, her mother's voice echoed, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just dance with your heart." Aaliyah lifted her chin. She stepped into the center of the room. For the first time, every gaze was truly locked onto her. But not with admiration. They were waiting to watch her break. The air in the studio thickened, like an invisible fog settling into every corner. No one spoke, but this silence wasn't gentle. It was heavy, like an iron collar tightening around Aaliyah's throat, making each breath feel labored. She stood, in the center of the wooden floor, feeling as if the ground beneath her was tilting. Sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows, casting pale gold stripes across the floor. But there was no warmth. They weren't beams of light meant to honor her. They were spotlights meant to expose her. Every gaze was on her, not with anticipation, not with encouragement. They were waiting for a stumble, for humiliation, for proof that she didn't belong here. In front of her, Mr. Coleman stood with his arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side. He didn't need to state his expectations. Everyone understood what he was waiting for. Failure. I'm still waiting, Aaliyah. The words were light, but they landed like a sentence passed down in a courtroom. A few students huddled closer, exchanging amused glances. A stifled giggle echoed from the corner of the room, quickly smothered. She could feel the quiet thrill in their eyes. She knew. They were waiting for her to fall. Aaliyah felt the invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Her lungs tightened, not because she didn't know how to dance, but because she knew. No matter how well she performed, it wouldn't matter. She could see it in Mr. Coleman's eyes. No judgment, no outright dismissal. Something worse. He looked at her the way one looks at an experiment doomed to fail, as if, even if she danced, nothing would change the truth. She did not belong here. She probably doesn't even know how to dance. A voice, soft but sharp as a blade. No one contradicted it, because they all believed it. The pain didn't come from the words themselves. It came from the truth behind them. They had never seen her as a real dancer. Half of her wanted to turn around, walk out of this room, escape the needlepoint stairs, piercing into her skin, to leave behind the judgment. Who would blame her if she gave up now? Who could fault her when she had never been welcomed here in the first place? She could walk away. She could let it all go. But the other half of her, the stronger half, refused. Aaliyah closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, deepened, as if she were reaching for something within herself. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she heard nothing. No laughter, no whispers, only one voice. Her mother's. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Warm, steady. Just dance with your heart. Aaliyah inhaled deeply. On the outside, she remained still. But inside, something surged. It was no longer fear. It was something more powerful. A realization. She wasn't dancing for them. She wasn't dancing for Mr. Coleman's approval. She wasn't dancing to prove her worth to anyone in this room. She was dancing for herself. Her eyes opened, and for the first time today, she chose not to step back. She planted her feet firmly against the floor, feeling the solid wood beneath her. It wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't foreign. It was a part of her. It had always been a part of her. A deep breath. Her arms lifted, reaching outward, her body growing lighter. Everything else faded. No more judgmental stares. No more mocking voices. There was only her and the dance. And in that moment, Aaliyah began to move. Aaliyah stood in the center of the room, her breath heavy. The wooden floor beneath her was cool, like a stream of icy water seeping through her soles, creeping into her bones. She could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on her shoulders. No encouragement, no anticipation, just cold observation. A silent, merciless waiting. They were waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to stumble, falter, collapse, waiting for proof that she didn't belong here. Aaliyah closed her eyes. From somewhere, deep within, a warm voice echoed, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just dance with your heart." Her mother's voice, a deep breath. She lifted her foot and began. At first, Aaliyah moved hesitantly. She turned slowly, her stretches stiffer than usual. She felt as if invisible strings were binding her, constraining her movements. A part of her was still trapped in the judgment surrounding her. "She doesn't even know what she's doing." A voice rang out from the back of the room. A quiet giggle followed, just loud enough for her to hear. Aaliyah clenched her fists. Anger, humiliation, the crushing weight of rejection. It all surged inside her. But this time, she didn't let it drown her. This time, she refused to back down. She inhaled deeply, and then she let it all go. This time, she didn't think about technique. She didn't think about pleasing anyone. She let her body take the lead. A turn, smooth, decisive, fierce as the wind. A leap, weightless as a feather, as if she was flying rather than dancing. Everything she had ever learned, ever felt, ever longed for, poured into each movement. She was no longer bound by the rigid molds of ballet. She wasn't just dancing. She was telling a story. Every step, every reach, was a piece of her story. Of the years spent on the sidelines, unseen. Of the countless nights practicing alone in the dark. Of the fear, the doubt, the moments she almost gave up, but still kept going. She wasn't just performing. She was setting herself free. And that was when everything changed. A student's eyes widened, lips slightly parted, as if she had forgotten how to close them. Another lowered her hands, abandoning the hair tie she had been playing with. No one spoke. No whispers. No disdainful glances. Just a thick, stunned silence. Not of discomfort, but of pure, unfiltered awe. Someone inhaled sharply, as if realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. And then, a voice, too quiet to be stopped. "Oh my God, she's actually incredible." The words dropped like a stone into water. Ripples spread across the room, exchanges of glances, shifting perceptions. The girl they had mocked, the girl they had dismissed, was now the girl they couldn't look away from. And even Mr. Coleman, so confident in his ability to judge, for the first time, had nothing to say. The ballet studio was no longer the same, and no one in that room could deny what was happening before their eyes. Aaliyah's foot touched the floor. The soft tap of her ballet shoe against the wooden surface rang out like a thunderclap, shattering the heavy silence that had suffocated the room. Her breath was still uneven, her chest rising and falling with each pulse of exertion. But her body no longer trembled. She had poured everything into each movement. She had let her soul speak for her. And now, as the dance came to an end, she could feel something shift. But it wasn't within her. It was in them. She lifted her head and met a silence unlike any before. The entire room stood frozen in time, faces carved into expressions of sheer disbelief. No more sneers, No more sideways glances filled with mockery. No more veiled contempt hidden behind polite smiles. Only wide eyes, stunned and unblinking, as if they had just witnessed something impossible. A few students stood motionless, fingers halted mid-air as if they had intended to clap, but had forgotten how. Parted lips, yet no words escaped. As if even the slightest sound could shatter the fragile magic of this moment. Mr. Coleman still stood there, but something had changed. His arms were no longer crossed in smug dismissal. His brows no longer arched in condescension. Instead, he hesitated, lips pressed into a tight line. His eyes no longer held the certainty they once did. What had he expected? A disaster. A girl crumbling under pressure, unable to keep up with the real dancers. He had assumed she would fail, but she hadn't. She had left the entire room breathless. For the first time in his life, Richard Coleman had nothing to say. He couldn't tell her she wasn't good enough. He couldn't tell her she didn't belong in ballet, because he had seen it with his own eyes. And then, a single clap. Soft, tentative. Aaliyah blinked. Someone in the class had reacted before they could. Stop themselves! The sound rang through the quiet like a ripple on still water. Then another clap. Louder. Stronger. Then another. And then the entire room erupted. Applause thundered through the studio, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner. No hesitation, no obligation, it was real. Those who had once laughed now nodded in admiration. Those who had mocked now looked at her with something else entirely. No more scorn, no more doubt, only respect. Aaliyah was no longer an outsider in this world. She was an artist. She glanced at Mr. Coleman. She didn't expect him to clap. She didn't need his praise or his approval. But even without a word, his eyes said everything. In that moment, he knew he had been wrong, not because someone forced him to admit it, not because he had been pressured to change his mind, but because the truth had spoken for itself. Through every step Aaliyah had taken. For the first time, he couldn't deny it. Talent had no color. As the applause roared around her, Aaliyah stood still. She didn't turn away. She didn't run. She didn't lower her gaze. She met every stare head-on. Not as someone desperate for validation, but as someone who belonged, because she always had. She had never needed them to see it. She only needed to believe it herself. And now, she knew no one could take that from her. Not Mr. Coleman. Not anyone in this room. No one. Aaliyah had won. And without a single word, everyone knew it. The applause still thundered through the ballet studio. Students stood scattered across the room, their eyes locked on Aaliyah. Some shook their heads in disbelief, as if they couldn't quite process what had just happened. Aaliyah remained where she was, her breathing now steady. But one person did not clap Mr. Coleman. He stood rigid, his eyes fixed on her, and in them, there was no longer contempt. His lips parted. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. He should have said something. He should have reminded her that ballet wasn't just about emotion. It was about technique. He should have dismissed her performance, the way he always did with those he deemed unfit. But even he couldn't deny what had just happened. She hadn't just danced well. She had touched something deeper, something ballet rarely reached. She had given it a soul. A chill ran down his spine. This feeling. He had felt it before, but from the other side. Suddenly, time rewound. Years ago, A 16-year-old Richard Coleman stood in the center of a ballet studio. His eyes shone with quiet desperation, his fists clenched tight. Before him stood his teacher, a man with an icy stare. "You don't have what it takes to pursue ballet professionally." The words fell like a verdict. Young Richard wanted to scream, to prove them wrong. But all he could do was lower his head, fists trembling at his sides. The class continued around him. No one cared. No one defended him. And now, Aaliyah stood in the center of the room, just as he once had. Except for one difference. She didn't lower her head. She didn't let words bury her dreams. She had done what he never could. She had stood her ground. And now, he was the one trying to crush that fire. A soft breeze drifted through the room. Stirring the curtains, Mr. Coleman clenched his hands. This feeling, it wasn't anger, it wasn't wounded pride, it was regret. He had become the very kind of teacher he once despised. He had used his authority to decide who was worthy and who wasn't. And he had been wrong. Aaliyah stood tall. She didn't need Mr. Coleman to say anything. She didn't need his praise. She didn't need his apology. Because now she knew. She had never needed his approval to prove her worth. And now, he knew it too. The applause finally faded, but the ballet studio did not return to what it once was. The air felt frozen. Everyone in the room was waiting for something. Everyone, except Mr. Coleman. He stood there, still unable to speak. His face no longer held its usual coldness, but it hadn't completely crumbled either. It lingered somewhere in between, a state of inner conflict, of resistance and reckoning. His eyes stayed locked on Aaliyah. He should say something. He should regain control. But every word he had prepared in his mind now felt useless. He couldn't say she lacked technique, because she had danced flawlessly. He couldn't say ballet wasn't meant for her, because she had just proven the opposite. He couldn't hold on to his old convictions, because the entire room had just been changed by her. Everything he had believed in had just been shattered. In a single moment, the door swung open. A gust of wind swept through, carrying with it the breath of change. Ms. Bennett stepped inside. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone was enough to silence the room once more. Her gaze swept over the students. Some still stood in shock, unsure how to react. Others lowered their heads, as if just now realizing they had been wrong. And then her eyes found Mr. Coleman. Her voice was calm, yet it carried undeniable weight. Aaliyah doesn't need anyone's approval. The room held its breath. She stepped closer, standing face to face with him. Her talent has already spoken for itself. She paused, as if giving him a chance to respond. Mr. Coleman pressed his lips together. A flicker of defiance crossed his face. He didn't want to lose. But he had nothing left to fight with. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I was just teaching the way I thought was right." Ms. Bennett met his gaze. "Right for whom?" "A blade, sharp and precise." "For you? For the people who taught you?" Mr. Coleman swallowed. "Ballet is not a privilege, Richard. This wasn't just about Aaliyah. This was about an entire system, a world that had resisted change for far too long." The room grew heavier than ever. A chill ran down Mr. Coleman's spine. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was the one in the wrong. But he didn't know what to do with that realization. Everything he had built his beliefs on was crumbling. Memories came rushing back. The times he had been rejected, dismissed. The words he had once been told. Ballet isn't for you. And now, he had become the very person he once hated most. Ms. Bennet took a step back, looking across the room. From this moment on, ballet will no longer belong to just a chosen few. A single student clapped, then another. And then, thrice, entire room erupted, not just for Aaliyah, but for the shift that had truly begun. And this time, nothing could stop it. The applause finally died down, but its echoes lingered in the ballet studio. The way they looked at Aaliyah had changed, no longer filled with contempt, no longer clouded with doubt. Their eyes reflected something else now. Respect. Recognition. Aaliyah took a slow breath, her chest still rising and falling from exertion. She had done it. No one could deny it. And she didn't need anyone to. It was time to leave. She turned and walked toward the door. But just before her fingers touched the handle, she felt it. A gaze, sharp and unyielding, still fixed on her, Mr. Coleman. Unlike the others, he had not moved, had not clapped, had not spoken. He only stood there, silent, yet his eyes held something even he didn't fully understand. Aaliyah could sense it. This battle was not over. She stopped. Then, slowly, she turned back around. The greatest battles are not the ones fought with fire and fury. They are the ones fought in silence, when everything that needs to be said has already been made clear. Aaliyah faced Mr. Coleman, but this time she was no longer the timid girl standing in the corner. She met his gaze head-on. There was no defiance in her eyes, no resentment, only understanding, and an unspoken question. Do you have anything left to say? The room held its breath. Mr. Coleman opened his mouth, then closed it again, not because he had nothing to say, but because words no longer mattered. For a fleeting second, he no longer saw Aaliyah standing before him. He saw himself, not Richard Coleman, the instructor, but the 16-year-old boy he once was, standing in a different ballet studio, facing his own teacher. Ballet isn't for you. The words had carved themselves into his mind like a wound that never healed. How had he felt that day? Humiliated, angry, alone. He had sworn to himself that no one would ever look down on him again. But now, he realized, he had done the exact same thing to Aaliyah. He had built walls around her, the same way walls had been built around him. He had become the very person he once despised. Aaliyah waited. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She didn't need him to bow his head or admit he was wrong, because the truth had already spoken for itself. And more importantly, she no longer needed his validation. For the first time, she felt free, no longer drowning in fear, no longer trying to prove anything. She took a deep breath and said, "You were right about one thing." The room tensed, waiting. Dancing isn't just about technique. She paused, her gaze steady. Then a small smile, not mocking, not triumphant, just the simple truth. It's about heart. Silence stretched between them. No one knew how Mr. Coleman would react. He could deny it. He could find a way to argue. But he didn't. He only stood there, staring at Aaliyah. And something in his eyes had shifted. Then, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No one in the room spoke, but they had all seen it. Aaliyah didn't need another round of applause, didn't need praise. didn't need him to tell her how good she was. She had already won. But this victory was not about defeating someone. It was about reclaiming what had always been hers, the right to stand on that floor, the right to dance freely. Aaliyah turned. This time, she didn't look back. Her steps were steady, certain. The door opened. A soft breeze from the hallway drifted in, carrying the promise of something new. She stepped through, leaving behind a studio that would never be the same again. No one knew what Mr. Coleman was thinking. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone could feel it. And this time, even Mr. Coleman could feel it too. Spring sunlight poured through the grand hallways of Westbridge Academy. The towering glass windows reflected golden light onto the polished marble floors, casting shimmering streaks that danced with every step. The air felt different today. Conversations buzzed louder. Groups of students gathered in hushed clusters, whispering about something posted on the main bulletin board. Something important. The official cast list. And in the middle of it all, Aaliyah Carter stood in silence. Her heartbeat quickened. Not from fear, but because she knew that no matter what the list said, she was a dancer. She stepped forward, drawing in a slow, steady breath. The crisp white sheets were pinned neatly to the board, the names of the selected dancers printed in bold. Her eyes scanned the list. Her pulse pounded with every passing second. Name after name blurred past her vision. And then she saw it, Aaliyah Carter. Her name, right there, in the middle of the list, unshakable. She blinked, not out of shock, but because she had always known she belonged here. Whether they accepted it or not, the truth remained. She had won, not by defeating anyone, but by becoming herself. Not through pity, not through concession, but through undeniable reality. A breeze drifted through the hallway, rustling the edges of the posted papers. Students around her were still whispering, but this time, there were no taunts, no sneering glances, only curiosity. Not because they didn't understand why she was on the list, but because they had once thought this moment could never happen. And then, a voice rose beside her, hesitant, uncertain, but sincere. "Could you teach me some of your moves?" Aaliyah turned. Emily, the blonde girl who had once stood at the center of the class, one of the voices that had once ridiculed her. Emily's arms were no longer crossed in silent arrogance. Her eyes no longer gleamed with superiority. She was just a girl now, standing there, uncertain, hopeful. Aaliyah held her gaze. A week ago, if someone had told her this moment would come, she wouldn't have believed it. But now, everything had changed. No apologies were spoken, no justifications offered, and they weren't needed. Because Aaliyah didn't need to hear the words to know. They had changed. A week ago, she never would have imagined this. But today, she simply smiled. Not a smile of victory, but of forgiveness. She nodded. Of course, in a quiet corner of Westbridge Academy, Mr. Coleman stood watching. No one noticed him. No one knew what he was thinking. But still, he stood there, watching, taking in the scene before him. Aaliyah, Emily, and the other students practicing their ballet moves right there in the hallway. For the first time, he had nothing to say. No pride, no rejection, only silent acceptance. He didn't clap. He didn't step forward to acknowledge her. But he didn't look away either. And in that moment, he understood. Aaliyah hadn't just changed her own place in this school. she had changed an entire system. Not through defiance, not through revenge, but through her talent and her kindness. Aaliyah lifted her gaze to the endless blue sky beyond, the grand windows. A week ago, the world of ballet had been a cage, built from prejudice, lined with whispered cruelty, sealed with quiet disdain. Today, those walls no longer existed, not because they had changed, but because she had. She no longer sought approval, no longer waited for someone else to acknowledge her worth, because she had always been enough. She took a deep breath and moved forward. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And today, love has won. Do you believe that everyone deserves a chance to shine, no matter who they are? If you do, hit like to spread the message that passion and talent know no limits. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful and inspiring stories to come.